My brother didn't just steal my company 10 years ago. He stole the next decade of my life. He spent billions building a legacy on top of my ruins, mocking my stationary life while he climbed toward the sun. But he forgot one detail. You can build a bridge to the future if you don't own the dirt at the end of it. The 10-year trap is finally shut. And Julian, he's just realizing I'm the one holding the keys. He laughed while he poured the vintage Cabernet, the sound echoing off the marble floors of a house my inheritance had partially funded. He had forgotten that I was even in the room. Or perhaps he simply didn't care that I was the only witness to his confession of how he had dismantled my first company. I poured my own water in silence, watching the ice cubes settle, knowing that he had just handed me the final piece of a puzzle I had been solving for 10 years. The dining room of my brother's estate smelled of expensive cedar and the lingering scent of arrogance. It was the annual family reunion, an event designed specifically to reinforce a hierarchy that had been set in stone a decade ago. At the head of the table sat Julian, radiant, in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He was the success story, the visionary, the man who had saved the family legacy from the brink of ruin. I sat at the far end, near the kitchen door. In Julian's world, seating was never accidental. It was a message. "Christopher, you're looking quiet tonight," Julian said, his voice carrying that familiar, polished warmth that he used on shareholders and victims alike. He leaned forward, tilting his head with a look of feigned concern. "Are you still doing that little consulting thing from your apartment? It's admirable, really. Not everyone is built for the pressure of the big leagues." He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. Julian's social tactic was a masterclass in subtle erasure. He would ask a question, pause for exactly half a second, and then provide the answer himself, effectively narrating my life for the rest of the family. "I've always said it," Julian continued, glancing around the table at our cousins and aunts. "Our Christopher has the heart of a poet, too soft for the jagged edges of high finance. It's why I had to step in back then. Someone had to steer the ship before he drowned us all." I felt the eyes of my family turn toward me, some with pity, others with the bored indifference people reserve for a relative who had become a cautionary tale. I didn't correct him. I didn't remind them that 10 years ago, my firm had been 3 days away from a breakthrough before the regulatory issues miraculously appeared, and Julian rescued my assets for pennies on the dollar. I simply took a slow sip of water. I observed the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the wine bottle, a micro-tremor he couldn't hide from someone who had spent a decade watching him from the shadows. "It's important to know one's place, don't you think?" Julian added, clicking his tongue against his teeth. That was his signature. A small, rhythmic sound that preceded every condescending remark. It was the sound of a man who believed he was the only architect in a world full of bricks. The conversation moved on to his latest venture, the Blackwood expansion. He spoke of it with a fervor that bordered on religious. It was to be his masterpiece, a multi-billion-dollar logistics hub that would solidify his legacy. He mentioned the land acquisitions, the zoning victories, and the political favors he had traded. He looked like a man who had already won. I watched him. I noticed the way he avoided eye contact when he mentioned the northeast sector, the small plot of land that was the literal bottleneck of his entire project. To the rest of the family, he was a giant. To me, he was a man standing on a platform with one very loose screw. "You should come by the office sometime, Chris," Julian said, throwing a casual wave in my direction as the servants cleared the plates. "We might have an opening in the filing department. It's good to keep it in the family, right?" A few of our cousins chuckled. I smiled, a small, thin expression that didn't reach my eyes. "I appreciate the offer, Julian," I said softly. My voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the boisterous noise of the room. "But I think I'll stay exactly where I am for now. I've grown quite fond of the view from the sidelines." He smirked, satisfied that he had once again put me in my place. He had no way of knowing that the little consulting thing he mocked had a very specific client list. He had no way of knowing that for 3,650 days, I had been breathing his air, studying his debts, and buying the ground he was currently planning to build his future upon. The dinner ended as it always did, with Julian holding court in the library and me slipping out the side door into the cool night air. As I walked to my car, I looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion. Julian thought he was the narrator of this story. He thought the book was already closed. He didn't realize that I hadn't even finished the first chapter. I started my engine and sat in the dark for a moment, the silence of the car a sanctuary after the performative noise of the house. I pulled a small, worn ledger from my glove box. I checked a single box next to a property deed. Everything was in place. The question was no longer if he would fall, But how long I wanted to watch him climb before I removed the ladder. Did Julian realize that the person he spent 10 years belittling was the only person who could now decide his future? The Blackwood Gala was not merely a celebration. It was a coronation. Held at the Metropolitan Museum, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the stifling weight of old money. Julian had spared no expense. The guest list was a tactical map of power, governors, hedge fund titans, and the architects of the city's skyline. This was the night Julian would officially announce the groundbreaking of the Blackwood expansion. I arrived precisely 10 minutes late. In a world obsessed with visibility, lateness is a quiet way of reclaiming your time. I wore a suit that was perfectly tailored but intentionally unremarkably a deep charcoal that allowed me to blend into the shadows of the marble columns. I was the ghost at the feast, a role I had perfected over a decade of observation. Julian, however, was a sun that demanded planets to orbit him. He stood on a raised dais in the center of the hall, his hand resting familiarly on the shoulder of the state senator. His behavioral signature was in full effect. The rhythmic clicking of his tongue, followed by a laugh that sounded a bit too practiced. He saw me near the back, and I watched the flicker of annoyance cross his face before he smoothed it over with a mask of pity. He signaled for me to come closer. As I approached the inner circle of the elite, Julian's voice rose, ensuring that the surrounding power players could hear his charity. "Ah, Christopher, you made it," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I was worried you'd got lost on the subway. It's a bit different from your usual scenery, isn't it?" The senator chuckled politely. Julian didn't stop. He loved the audience. He loved the contrast between his golden boy persona and my lost cause reputation. It made his light seem brighter. "Everyone, this is my brother," Julian announced, spreading his arms wide. "He's the conscience of the family. While I'm out here moving mountains and pouring concrete, Christopher reminds us all of the virtues of a quiet, stationary life. He's my most loyal critic." It was a public erasure, disguised as a compliment. By calling me a critic, he dismissed any valid concerns I might have as mere sibling jealousy. By calling me stationary, he told the most powerful men in the room that I was a nobody. I didn't flinch. I simply looked him in the eye and gave a slight, respectful nod. "The project is ambitious, Julian," I said, my voice low and calm. "I hope the foundation is as solid as the rhetoric." Julian's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and victory. "The foundation is iron, little brother. I've secured everything. The permits, the politicians, and most importantly, the land. By tomorrow morning, I'll own the final piece of the northeast sector. The deal is already being signed as we speak." He turned back to the crowd, raising his glass. "A toast," he shouted. "To progress, to the Blackwood expansion, and to the realization that in this world, there are those who build and those who watch." The room erupted in applause. Julian took a long, triumphant drink. He then did something he had never done before, something that crossed the line from subtle disrespect into active humiliation. He pulled a small silver coin from his pocket and tossed it into my half-full champagne glass. "For your subway fare home, Chris," he whispered, loud enough for the first 3 rows of guests to hear. "I wouldn't want you to feel like you left empty-handed on my big night." The humiliation was symbolic, but the silence that followed was deafening. I looked down at the coin resting at the bottom of the flute. My cousins were snickering. My aunts turned their heads away, embarrassed by the display, but unwilling to challenge the man who paid for their lifestyle. I felt the familiar sting of the weak Christopher label being pinned to my chest in front of everyone who mattered. I didn't pour the drink out. I didn't shout. I didn't even look angry. I simply took the flute, fished the coin out with 2 fingers, and dried it meticulously with my pocket square. I looked at the date on the coin. 2016. The year he had stolen my company. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice unwavering. "I'll keep this. It's a good reminder of what things are actually worth." I turned and walked away. I could feel Julian's smirk burning into my back. He thought he had just finished me. He thought that by publicly mocking my poverty and my passivity, he had removed any threat I could ever pose. He was so intoxicated by his own narrative that he didn't notice the one thing that mattered. As I exited the gala, I pulled out my phone. I had a single unread message from my lawyer, a man Julian didn't know existed. It contained a scanned PDF of a land deed for a small 3-acre plot in the northeast sector, the Bottleneck. Julian had just boasted about owning. The signature on the deed wasn't Julian's, it was mine. I had purchased it through a series of shell companies 4 years ago, waiting for the moment Julian's expansion would become physically impossible without it. He had spent billions on the surrounding land, on the blueprints, and on the political bribes. He had built a massive, expensive bridge that led directly into a wall that I owned. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold New York air filling my lungs. Inside, the music was still playing. Julian was still laughing. He was currently signing contracts that obligated him to complete the project within 18 months, with massive daily penalties for every day he was over schedule. He had just legally bound his entire fortune to a project that required my permission to exist. I looked at the silver coin Julian had given me. It was a small price to pay for the look that would eventually cross his face when he realized that the stationary brother he had mocked was the only person standing between him and total bankruptcy. I thought about his behavioral signature, that rhythmic clicking of his tongue. I wondered if he would still do it when the bank started calling in the loans. I wondered if he would still call me soft when he had to come to my small apartment to beg for the 3 acres of dirt that held his life in the balance. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I felt a profound, heavy sense of clarity. For 10 years, I had been the soft one, the failure, the quiet one. But silence isn't a lack of sound. It's a gathering of power. I checked the time. It was 11:45 p.m. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, Julian's surveyors would reach the fence line of the northeast sector. They would find a brand new private property sign and a legal injunction halting all work. The gala was the peak of his life. From this moment on, every step he took would be downhill. I walked toward the subway, the silver coin tucked safely in my pocket. I didn't need a taxi. I wanted to be among the people. Julian despised the stationary people who moved the world while men like him just talked about it. I had been patient for 3,650 days. I could wait a few more hours for the first crack to appear in his empire. Julian's greatest fear was a loss of control. He had spent his entire life manipulating the people around him like chess pieces. He believed he had mastered the game. But as I descended into the underground, I realized that Julian had made the fatal mistake of all narcissists. He assumed the person he was playing against was also playing chess. He didn't realize I had been playing a different game entirely. The train arrived, the screech of metal on metal, a harsh contrast to the refined violins of the gala. I stepped inside and sat down, leaning my head against the window. I closed my eyes and imagined the breaking news headlines that would inevitably follow in the months to come. Blackwood expansion, halted by a mysterious landowner. Julian's empire on the brink. He had called me a poet earlier that night. Perhaps he was right. Because there is a certain poetry in watching a man drown in the very ocean he tried to steal from you. As the train pulled away from the station, I felt a single, quiet thought settle in my mind. It wasn't a thought of revenge. It was a thought of justice. Justice isn't loud. It isn't violent. It is simply the inevitable weight of truth finally catching up to a lie. Julian had spent 10 years building a house of cards. I was simply the wind that had finally decided to blow. Why did Julian assume that the silence of a victim meant the victim had forgotten the crime? The morning after the gala did not bring a frantic phone call, nor did I expect one. Men like Julian do not panic when the first pebble falls. They only panic when they realize the pebble was the start of an avalanche. I spent the morning in my apartment, the one Julian mocked for its stationary view. I made a single pot of black tea and sat at my desk, watching the sun hit the brickwork of the neighboring building. In my world, the silence was a tool. In Julian's world, it was a vacuum he felt compelled to fill with noise. I opened my laptop and checked the remote feed from the northeast sector. 3 acres of scrubland, tall grass, and a rusted wire fence. At 9:15 a.m., a white pickup truck with a Blackwood construction logo pulled up to the perimeter. 2 men in high-visibility vests stepped out, blueprints rolled under their arms. They walked toward the fence line, intending to mark the spot where the primary support pylons for the northeast bridge would be sunk. They stopped. They stared at the sign I had installed under the cover of darkness. Private property, no trespassing. All inquiries to Miller and Associates. I watched as one of them pulled out a radio. He looked confused, then annoyed, then back at his map. He was a small gear in a massive machine, suddenly grinding against a grain of sand he didn't expect to be there. I closed the laptop. The machinery of the law would take it from here. The first month was a study in calculated distance. Julian's legal team reached out to Miller and Associates, a firm that consisted of one very expensive, very bored lawyer who had been on my retainer for 3 years. They offered a fair market value for the 3 acres. Miller declined, stating that his client was not interested in selling at this time. They doubled the offer. Miller declined again. Then came the time skip. 2 months passed. I did not call Julian. I did not visit the office. I didn't even post on social media. I lived my life in the gray spaces, consulting for the very firms Julian considered his rivals, providing them with the intelligence they needed to hedge against his expansion. Every day the Blackwood expansion remained stalled. Julian was losing approximately $400,000 in interest, labor standby fees, and contractual penalties. I spent my evenings in the library, reading. I wasn't reading about finance. I was reading about the siege of Elysor. I was studying the art of waiting. Julian was a man of the blitz. He won by overwhelming force and speed. To defeat him, I simply had to remove the speed from his equation. By the third month, the Northeast sector had become a headline in the business journals. The 3-acre hole in Julian's pocket. People were starting to ask questions. Who was Miller and Associates? Who was the mystery owner holding the golden ticket? Julian's public image began to fray. In televised interviews, his behavioral signature, that rhythmic clicking of the tongue, became more frequent, more frantic. He looked tired. The charming, polished mask was slipping, revealing a man who was beginning to realize that he had built a cathedral on a swamp. One Tuesday, exactly 90 days after the gala, I received a hand-delivered letter. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was on personal stationery. Christopher, enough of this. Let's have lunch. My club, Friday, at 1 p.m. Don't be late. No. Dear Christopher, no best regards. Just the command of a brother who still thought he held the leash. I didn't reply. I simply showed up on Friday, at 1:15 p.m. The club was a temple of mahogany and hushed whispers. Julian was sitting in a corner booth, a half-empty glass of scotch in front of him. It was barely past noon. When he saw me, he didn't stand, he didn't smile. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and genuine bewilderment. "Sit down, Chris," he said, the tongue click echoing in the quiet room. "I don't have time for the dramatics. Tell your client, whoever this Miller guy is fronting for, that I'm willing to go 5 times the market rate. It's a ridiculous sum for a patch of dirt, but I'm in a generous mood." I didn't touch the menu. I just looked at him. "You look tired, Julian," I said. My voice was as calm as the tea I had brewed that morning. "The expansion seems to be taking a toll." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "It's a minor zoning hiccup, Chris. A nuisance suit from some faceless scavenger trying to squeeze me for a payday. I've dealt with 1,000 people like this. They always break. They always take the money. Maybe this one is different," I suggested. Julian leaned across the table, his eyes bloodshot. "Everyone has a price. You know that better than anyone. Remember 10 years ago, you had a price. Your company had a price. I bought your future for the cost of a few regulatory fines. This landowner, he's just another you. He's just waiting for the right number." The air in the room seemed to grow heavy. He was admitting it again, gloating about the sabotage that had cost me my life's work. He felt so safe in his power that he didn't realize he was speaking to the scavenger he was looking for. "I don't think he wants the money, Julian," I said. Julian scoffed. "Then what does he want? Blood? Stature? He's holding up a $4 billion project. He's hurting the state economy. He's hurting family." I tilted my head. "Family? That's a powerful word. Do you remember what you said at the gala? About building and watching? About the subway fare?" Julian's expression shifted. The smirk didn't return, but a flicker of recognition did. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a decade. He looked at the suit I was wearing, the one that was unremarkable but perfectly tailored. He looked at my hands, which were steady on the table. "Chris," he started, his voice dropping an octave. "Who are you working for?" "I'm working for the owner of the Northeast sector," I replied. "And he has a very specific request. He doesn't want 5 times the market rate. He doesn't want 10 times. "Then what?" Julian hissed. "What does he want?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver coin Julian had tossed into my glass 3 months ago. I placed it on the mahogany table between us. The light from the chandelier caught the dull metal. "He wants you to understand the value of things," I said. Julian stared at the coin. I watched the gears turn behind his eyes. I watched the blood drain from his face as the math finally added up. He looked at the coin, then at me, then back at the coin. "You," he whispered. The word was barely a breath. "It's you, Miller. Christopher Miller. Our mother's maiden name. You used the inheritance. I didn't confirm it. I didn't deny it. I simply sat in the silence." "You've been buying that land for years," Julian said, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp rage. "While you sat at my table, while you ate my food, you were planning this. You were waiting for me to commit the capital." "I was being stationary, Julian," I said. "Just like you told me to be." He lunged forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "I will destroy you. I'll have the land seized by eminent domain. I'll tie you up in court until you're 90. You think you can stop me? I am the Blackwood expansion. Eminent domain takes years. Julian, I said, my voice rising not even a decibel. Your bridge pylons were supposed to be in the ground last month. Your creditors are already circling. The senator you were photographed with at the gala. He stopped taking your calls yesterday. I know, because I'm the one who leaked the internal audit of your offshore accounts to his office. Julian froze. The silence returned. But this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of the library or the apartment. It was the silence of a tomb. You don't just want the land, Julian said, his voice breaking. You want everything. I don't want anything of yours, Julian, I said, standing up. I just want back what you took from me. Adjusted for 10 years of interest. I left the silver coin on the table. Lunch is on me, I said. I believe that coin should cover the subway fare home when they seize your car next week. I walked out of the club and into the sunlight. I didn't look back. I knew that Julian was sitting there, clicking his tongue against his teeth, trying to find a social tactic that could undo a decade of patient strategy. But there is no tactic for the truth. I walked 3 blocks to a small park and sat on a bench. For the first time in 10 years, the memory lane of the family reunion didn't feel like a hallway of thorns. It felt like a map. I had made my quiet decision. I had spent the paperwork, the timing, and the distance. I had reached the point of no return. The consequences were no longer in my hands. They were in the hands of the banks, the lawyers, and the very people Julian had stepped on to climb his mountain. I was just the man who had bought the 3 acres at the bottom of the slope. As I watched the city move around me, I realized that I didn't feel the revenge I thought I would. I felt a cold, clean sense of completion. The power hadn't just shifted. It had vanished from Julian and returned to its rightful place. Julian's greatest fear was a loss of control. He was about to find out what happens when the person holding the strings finally lets go. If Julian had been the architect of my ruin, why was he the one now standing in the rubble? The collapse did not happen with a bang. It happened with a series of quiet, bureaucratic thuds. For the first 2 weeks after our lunch, Julian tried to maintain the facade. He released a press statement claiming that landowner negotiations were nearing a favorable conclusion. He even doubled down on his media appearances, smiling through the clicking of his teeth, promising that the Blackwood expansion was still the future of the region. But I knew the truth. I was the one who had choreographed the silence. I spent my mornings at a small cafe, 3 blocks from Julian's corporate headquarters. From my window seat, I watched the subtle shifts in the ecosystem. I saw the black town cars that usually sat idling out front begin to disappear. I saw the 4 lease signs appearing on the lower floors of his secondary office buildings. Julian's empire was a vast, interconnected web of debt, and I had pulled a single thread that held the tension. By the 3rd week, the panic began to leak into the public sphere. It started with a leaked memo from the primary lender, a global bank that had backed Julian for 20 years. They were declaring a material adverse change in the project. Because Julian couldn't secure the northeast sector, the entire $4 billion loan was being called into technical default. I watched the news on a muted television in the cafe. Julian was being chased to his car by reporters. His polished charcoal suit looked rumpled. His hair, usually a silver helmet of perfection, was windblown and thinning. He didn't look like a titan anymore. He looked like a man who was realization heavy and sleep-light. My phone remained silent. I had blocked Julian's personal number, his office line, and even our mother's landline. I wasn't being cruel. I was being consistent. In our family, the weak Christopher was the one who always picked up the phone to hear Julian's excuses. The new Christopher didn't exist in Julian's directory. Then, the confusion set in for Julian. He couldn't understand why his usual tactics weren't working. He tried to sue me for tortious interference, but the paperwork I had filed over the last decade was a labyrinth of legal perfection. Every shell company was compliant. Every land purchase was transparently recorded under Miller and Associates. He tried to go to the press to paint me as a bitter brother holding progress hostage, but I simply didn't respond. A story needs 2 sides to stay alive in the news cycle. By refusing to speak, I gave the media nothing but Julian's increasingly erratic outbursts. He looked like a madman shouting at a wall. On a Tuesday afternoon, I received a visit, not from Julian, but from his chief financial officer, a man named Marcus, who had been Julian's shadow for 15 years. We met in a public park, sitting on a bench near a playground. "He's losing it, Chris," Marcus said, staring at his shoes. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and was just waiting for the fire to reach him. He spent all night in the boardroom throwing chairs. "He keeps talking about the land like it's a person, like it's you." The land is just dirt, Marcus, I said. It's Julian who turned it into a person. The banks are seizing the collateral next week, Marcus continued, his voice shaking. The estate, the jet, the holdings in the city. He's going to be left with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a mountain of lawsuits. He wants to know what it will take for you to stop. I looked at a young mother pushing her child on a swing nearby. The simplicity of the scene was a sharp contrast to the wreckage Marcus was describing. I haven't started anything, Marcus, I said quietly. I'm just standing on my own property. If the world Julian built around that property is falling apart, that's a structural flaw in his design, not mine. He's family, Chris, Marcus pleaded. He told me that at lunch, I replied. He also told me that I had a price. He was wrong. Silence doesn't have a price. It only has a consequence. I stood up to leave. Marcus grabbed my sleeve, his eyes desperate. He doesn't understand why you're doing this. He thinks he saved you 10 years ago. He actually believes his own lie. That, I said, gently removing his hand, is the most dangerous part of Julian's nature. He forgot where the story began. I'm just making sure he stays for the ending. I walked away, leaving Marcus on the bench. As I walked, I felt a strange, hollow sensation. For 10 years, my life had been defined by Julian, by his shadow, his mockery, and my response to it. Now, as his shadow was retreating, I was finding out who I was without him. The consequences phase was the hardest to watch, not because I felt pity, but because it was so predictable. I watched as his board of directors voted to remove him. I watched as the state senator released a statement distancing the office from the Blackwood scandal. I watched as Julian's wife filed for legal separation, citing irreconcilable financial irregularities. Julian was experiencing the silent withdrawal of support on a global scale. He was finding out that when you build your life on the humiliation of others, you find yourself very alone when the floorboards start to rot. By the end of the month, the northeast sector was a ghost town. The construction equipment had been hauled away. The half-finished bridge pylons stood like ancient broken ruins against the skyline. Julian's empire had been liquidated to pay back the primary lenders. He had gone from a billionaire to a man with a negative net worth in less than 90 days. I received one final piece of mail. It was a foreclosure notice for the family estates, the house where Julian had mocked me over Cabernet. It was being auctioned off. I didn't buy it. I didn't want the house. I wanted the silence that now filled its halls. I stayed in my stationary apartment. I continued my little consulting thing. My life didn't change much, which was the ultimate irony. I had been living within my means for a decade, while Julian had been living on the stolen futures of others. I didn't need the mansion to feel powerful. I had the deed to the 3 acres, and that was enough. One evening, I took a drive out to the northeast sector. I parked my car on the shoulder of the road and walked to the fence line. The private property sign was still there, a bit faded by the sun. I looked at the massive, empty construction site. Millions of dollars of steel and concrete, rendered useless because of a few thousand square feet of grass. It was a monument to the observer effect. By simply watching and waiting, I had forced Julian to reveal his own instability. I hadn't raised a hand. I hadn't shouted. I had simply refused to be erased. As I stood there, I heard a car pull up behind mine. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of the engine. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind of car Julian would have laughed at 3 months ago. I heard the door creak open. I heard the footsteps on the gravel. They were heavy, uneven. "You're standing on my bridge, Christopher," a voice said. It was Julian. But the voice didn't sound like the Julian I knew. It was raspy, thin, and stripped of all its polished warmth. I finally turned around. He looked 20 years older. He was wearing a cheap jacket and jeans. The behavioral signature was gone. There was no clicking of the tongue. There was only a profound, vibrating silence. "It's not a bridge yet, Julian," I said. "It's just a pile of rocks." He looked at the pylons, then back at me. "You destroyed me. For what? A company I took 10 years ago. I made that company a success. You would have failed anyway." "Maybe," I said. "But it would have been my failure, not your theft." He stepped closer, his face twisting into a mask of pure, concentrated hatred. "You think you've won. You're still nothing. You're still the quiet, pathetic brother who lives in a box while the rest of us move the world. I'll start again. I'll build something bigger. And I'll crush you under it." I didn't react. I didn't even smile. I just looked at him with the same psychological awareness I had practiced for a decade. I saw the fear behind the anger. I saw the realization that he had no moves left. "Julian," I said softly, "the bank didn't just take the project. They took the intellectual property. They took the name Blackwood. You can't start again. You don't have the credit. You don't have the friends. And most importantly, you don't have me to blame anymore. He froze. That was the one truth he couldn't gaslight away. Without a weak brother to act as his foil, Julian was just a man who had failed on a massive, public stage. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "Do you want me to beg? Is that what this was for?" "I want you to do what I did for 10 years, I said. "What's that?" "Be quiet," I replied, "and watch." I walked back to my car, leaving him standing at the edge of the dirt. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was just a small, dark shape against the massive, gray concrete pillars. He looked stationary. Justice had cost me my family, my time, and a decade of my youth. But as the lights of the city appeared on the horizon, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one wearing the shoes. If the world Julian built was a masterpiece of manipulation, why did it only take one honest man to bring it down? The final meeting didn't take place in a boardroom or a courtroom. It took place in my apartment. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, the city humming with its usual indifferent energy outside. There was a knock on the door, not the aggressive pounding of the Julian I used to know, but a hesitant, rhythmic tap. I opened the door. Julian stood there holding a thick manila envelope. He looked diminished, the sharp lines of his face replaced by a soft, hollowed-out exhaustion. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside and stood in the center of my living room, looking around at my bookshelves and my simple furniture as if he were inspecting a foreign planet. "I went to the archives," he said without a greeting. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual performative resonance. "I went back through the 2016 filings. The ones from your old company." I walked to the kitchen and began to prepare a pot of tea. I didn't offer him any. This wasn't a social call. It was a deposition of the soul. "And what did you find, Julian?" "I found the signature," he said, his hand trembling as he pulled a document from the envelope. "The inspector who flagged your ventilation systems. The one who triggered the stop work order that allowed me to buy your debt. He didn't exist. He was a consultant on my payroll using a shell name." He placed the paper on my dining table. It was the smoking gun I had known about for years. "I didn't need to look at it. I thought I was smarter than you," Julian whispered, the rhythmic clicking of his tongue starting up again, though now it sounded like a dying clock. "I thought your silence was a sign of defeat. I thought you were just broken. I never realized you were collecting every insult I gave you. Every time I mocked you at dinner, you weren't absorbing the damage. You were adding it to the bill." I brought my tea to the table and sat down. I looked at him looked at him without the veil of sibling obligation. "You were so busy narrating my life, Julian, that you forgot to live your own. You became a character in a play about your own greatness. I was just the one who owned the stage." "The banks are done," he said, ignored my comment. "They've finalized the liquidation. The Blackwood project is officially dead. The land you own, it's useless now. No one will build there for 50 years. You ruined yourself just to ruin me. We're both back at zero." I leaned back in my chair. This was the moment of the shift, the natural movement of power from the loud to the silent. "I'm not at zero, Julian," I said softly. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a second envelope. I slid it across the table toward him. He opened it slowly. His eyes widened. It wasn't a deed or a legal threat. It was an acquisition offer from a multinational green energy firm. They weren't looking to build a logistics hub or a bridge. They were looking to build a massive urban solar farm. And my 3 acres were the only part of the northeast sector that didn't have Blackwood debt attached to it. "They bought my land for 8 times what I paid for it," I explained. "And because your project collapsed and your creditors are desperate to recoup anything, I've used that capital to buy the surrounding lots from the bank at 10 cents on the dollar. I don't own a 3-acre bottleneck anymore, Julian. I own the entire sector." Julian's face went pale. The realization hit him like a physical blow. I hadn't just stopped him. I had waited for him to clear the forest so I could plant my own garden. I had used his own momentum to throw him off the cliff, and then I had bought the cliff. "You're a monster," he breathed, but there was no heat in it. Only a terrified kind of awe. "No," I replied. "I'm the poet you said I was. I just write in numbers and land deeds instead of verses." I stood up and walked to the door, holding it open. The reveal was complete. There was no need for a long speech or a dramatic confrontation. The truth was sitting on the table, in the form of a bank statement and a forged signature from 2016. Julian gathered his papers, his movements slow and uncoordinated. He stopped at the threshold and looked at me one last time. For a second, I saw the brother I used to look up to, the one who told me he'd always protect me. That person was long gone, buried under layers of greed and behavioral signatures. What am I supposed to do now? He asked. The same thing I did for 10 years, I said. Find a way to live with the person you actually are, instead of the one you pretend to be. I closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking was the most satisfying sound I had heard in a decade. I went back to my table, picked up my tea, and looked out the window. The power shift was total. Julian had the truth, and I had the peace. He had the memory of his empire, and I had the reality of my future. I felt no urge to gloat. I felt no need to call the rest of the family and tell them I had won. Some victories are so absolute that they don't require a witness. I looked at the silver coin still sitting on my shelf, the one Julian had tossed me for the subway. I picked it up and walked to the window. I didn't throw it. I simply let it rest in my palm, a small, heavy piece of history. Julian had spent his life trying to be the loudest voice in the room. He never understood that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has stopped talking and started listening. If the ultimate revenge is living well, why did it feel like the real justice was finally being able to hear myself think? 6 months passed before the dust truly settled. In the world of high finance, a collapse like Julian's is eventually treated like a natural disaster, something to be analyzed, archived, and then forgotten as the market moves toward the next shiny object. But in the world of a family, there is no such thing as moving on. There is only the long, quiet process of living among the ruins. I stayed in my apartment. The windfall from the solar project and the acquisition of the northeast sector had made me a wealthy man by any objective standard. But I found that my tastes hadn't changed with my bank balance. I still preferred the silence of my small kitchen, the weight of a physical book, and the anonymity of a morning walk through the park. Authority, I realized, isn't about the size of the house you live in. It's about the lack of people who can tell you what to do. The rest of the family reached out, of course. Once the news broke that I was the mystery owner who had successfully dismantled Julian's expansion and then subsequently profited from the fallout, the phone calls began. First, it was Aunt Claire, the woman who had looked away when Julian tossed that coin into my glass. Her voice on the voicemail was tentative, sweet, and layered with a newfound respect that made my skin crawl. She invited me to dinner, mentioning how she always knew I had my father's head for strategy. I didn't call her back. Then came the cousins, the ones who had snickered at the gala. They sent emails with business opportunities, acting as if the decade of mocking me had been a shared joke we were all in on. They wanted a seat at the table of my new venture. They wanted to know if I was hiring. I deleted the emails without reading past the first paragraph. Forgiveness is often framed as a gift to the person who did you wrong. But in the world of strategic silence, forgiveness is an option, not an obligation. I didn't hate them. To hate someone requires an emotional investment I wasn't willing to make. I simply viewed them as the stationary objects Julian had claimed I was. They were part of a landscape I had moved beyond. The only person I did see was our mother. She visited me on a Tuesday, bringing a tin of the lemon cakes Julian used to love. We sat in my living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching for the soft boy she had raised. He's living in a studio apartment in Jersey. Christopher, she said softly. He's working for a property management firm. Entry level. He says he doesn't want to see anyone. That's probably for the best, I replied, blowing the steam off my tea. He told me what happened. About 2016. About the land. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. He said you were the one who leaked the audit to the senator's office. He said you didn't just win. You ensured he could never come back. I looked at her, my expression neutral. Julian built his empire on a lie, Mother. I didn't destroy him. I just stopped participating in the lie. When the truth finally came out, he didn't have enough of a foundation to survive it. That wasn't my choice. It was his design. He's your brother, she whispered. And I was his, I said. But he didn't seem to remember that when he was dismantling my life to buy his first yacht. He didn't remember it when he tried to humiliate me in front of every person who mattered to our family. Being family isn't a shield you get to hide behind after you've spent 10 years using it as a target. She didn't argue. She knew I was right, even if the truth was a cold thing to hold. She left the cakes on the table, hugged me with a fragile kind of desperation, and walked out. I didn't feel a sense of triumph watching her go. I felt the weight of a redefined respect, the kind of respect that comes from fear rather than love. It was a high price to pay, but it was the only currency Julian's world accepted. A year later, the solar farm was completed. I took a drive out to the northeast sector one final time. The massive concrete pylons Julian had sunk into the earth were gone, ground down and covered by rows of sleek, silent blue panels. There was no noise here anymore. No shouting of foremen, no grinding of gears, no ego-driven speeches. Just the sun being turned into power, quietly and efficiently. I stood at the fence line and pulled the silver coin from my pocket. I looked at it for a long moment. It represented the moment Julian thought he had, the moment he thought he had finally reduced me to a footnote in his biography. I didn't throw it into the dirt. That would have been too much like a movie, too much like the melodrama I had spent my life avoiding. Instead, I walked back to my car and placed the coin in the cup holder. It was just a piece of metal now. It had no power over me. I had achieved justice, but it hadn't provided closure in the way people expect. The hole Julian had left in my life 10 years ago was still there. It had just been filled with something else, a hard, resilient layer of self-reliance. I had lost the brother I thought I had, but I had gained the man I was meant to be. As I drove back toward the city, I saw a billboard for a new development project. It was flashy, loud, and promised limitless growth. I found myself clicking my tongue against my teeth, not in Julian's rhythm, but in a slow, deliberate beat of my own. I wondered if Julian was watching the same news I was. I wondered if he still looked at the skyline and saw things he wanted to own. Or if he finally saw the truth, that everything you build with noise can be taken away in the silence. Some truths don't need witnesses. Some stories don't need a happy ending to be right. They just need an ending that matches the beginning. I had been the invisible heir for a long time. Now, I was just Christopher. And for the first time in 10 years, that was enough. The world Julian built was gone, and in its place was a quiet, functioning reality. I had paid for my justice with a decade of my life. But as the city lights blurred into a steady stream of gold, I knew I would make the same trade again. Because the only thing more dangerous than a man with everything to lose is a man with nothing but time, and the ability to stay silent. They say success is the best revenge. I disagree. The best revenge is being the only one who knows exactly how you did it. They finally understood. I didn't explain further. Some truths don't need witnesses.